I'm going to ask Lily if we can get going here, and she's giving me the go-ahead.
Okay.
4 p.m. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our special homecoming presentation, Explorer Scientist, Harry Fielding Reid, and the Case Tradition of the Intrepid Professor. I'm Robert Smith, the Communication Director of the Case Alumni Association and the moderator of today's presentation. You can add your questions using the chat button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try to get to them. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Tom Kicher, a 3-degree Case alumnus, Professor Emeritus of Engineering, and the former Dean of the Case School of Engineering. Many of you know Tom as an educator, but he's also a student of history. He's been delving into Case history and shedding light on extraordinary people like Harry Fielding Reid. Reid was a bold young professor at the Case School of Applied Science. In 1890, he led an expedition to Glacier Bay, Alaska, and took students along on the class trip of a lifetime. Tom's story on the trek can be found in the recent issue of Case Alumnus. Today, he'll present some of the highlights of that journey and answer your questions. Tom, welcome to our presentation.
Thanks, Bob. I'm glad to be here. This is the first time I've had a chance to lecture to anyone in almost 15 years now. And my voice is failing a little bit, but I'll try to speak up to make sure I reach everyone. I promise not to give a quiz, even though you might have done the homework and read the article in the Case Alumnus magazine. I owe a lot to you, Bob, for your great editing on that. You ready?
Great. So listen, to start off, who was Harry Fielding Reid and why is his legacy important for Case?
Well, much to many people's surprise, Harry Fielding Reid was the very first American geophysicist. And here we see three photographs of him. The one on the far right is a costume or a uniform that he frequently wore. This is what his appearance looked like as he would do his mountaineering and hiking in dry climates. Notice that he's wearing jodhpurs, hiking boots, but still wearing his vest and pocket watch. And of course, a hat. He always had to have a hat. I know that feeling. We need the protection from the sun. The photograph in the middle is a more formal picture, but my favorite is the one on the left. That's Harry in his senior years. I have a certain softness for seniors at this point. He was a pioneer in glaciology and seismology. In other words, the applied mechanics of the Earth. He studied glaciers for their fluid mechanics, their dynamics, and while he was a world's expert in it, he never did train a Ph.D. student in that field. His more famous activities came about in seismology, which started very early on. He launched his career at Case, much to many people's surprise. At the time, 1886, he hired on just after Katie Staley. Staley had arrived just months before Harry. There were 44 students, 8 faculty members. Harry made the 9th, and tuition was a whopping $75 a year. He arrived on campus. Bob arrived on campus the very day of the fire in the Case main building. That's the picture there on the left. It totally gutted the building.
Yeah.
The generosity of our neighbors, Western Reserve University, they loaned us classroom space and space in the dormitories. Most of the students lived at home, of course. The picture on the right I found in Harry's archives. That's a picture of the Case campus shortly after the building was completed. And you'll see behind it is the mechanical engineering laboratory and the chemistry building. He led an expedition to Glacier Bay in 1890 and took his students with him.
So why was that remarkable to go to Alaska in 1890?
Think of the times. Think of what was going on in the world at the time. 1890, we were in the Gilded Age. America was enjoying some prosperity. They were, it was the beginning of the machine element, or the machine period of the Industrial Revolution. Cleveland was growing as a trade center and a manufacturing center. Alaska was very much a frontier, and we'll talk a little more about that later on. Americans were becoming interested in nature. A lot of the natural wonders of the America were, particularly those in the East, were owned by private entrepreneurs. And, but America was making a change. They were seeking not only entertainment from visiting these natural wonders, but they were also on an intellectual pursuit. Finally, it was remarkable because he involved the students. Not only case students, but he involved some recent graduates of Yale University. If you were to visit Glacier Bay today, this is what you'd see. On the left is a calving glacier. For any of you who have not been there or have not seen this in action, it is absolutely spectacular. The tour boats have developed a certain respect for it. And if you tour Alaska, you will not get real close, but nevertheless, they can be heard. They are awfully noisy. For those of you that have never seen one, and for those of you who may have some curiosity of seeing some more, there are countless exhibits of this on YouTube. Some of the largest calving glaciers in the world are shown there, and they're quite spectacular.
So it's a pretty dramatic place he was going to, and an unexplored place. I'm wondering, what was Case like in the early days that a professor could take students and go explore uncharted lands?
Well, the faculty were hired for their prowess in teaching basic principles. Everything had to be based on math and science with a practical emphasis. Every faculty member had to have a professional practice. If they did not, they very often took a leave of absence to go off and develop a professional practice before returning to full-time teaching. And the faculty were encouraged to involve their students in their work. Let me give you just a few examples. Stockwell, who was a world-famous astronomer and mathematician even before Case was founded, was a close friend of Leonard Case Jr. Leonard Case Jr. sponsored him in much of his scientific investigation, particularly in the writing of memoirs. He was retained by the Board of Trustees to organize Case. Never accepted the title of president, but hired all the early faculty members. And in fact, visited a number of schools, including Johns Hopkins, in the process of planning the school and developing the school. Believe it or not, and this is not known by too many of our Case students, Stockwell was the one who finally figured out the mystery of ocean tides and their exact relationship to the periods of the moon. He developed a very accurate method of predicting tidal motion and published it in the US Geodetic Survey. Eisenman, another name that you might remember from Case, was the civil engineer, the only one, as a matter of fact. Civil engineering was the first of the engineering degrees offered by Case. One of the very first class projects was conducted by the graduating class of 1885. And here you see a map of University Circle. Look at it closely. There are 3 buildings: Adelbert Main, Case Main, and the dormitory. You'll notice that there's a railroad spur going from the New York Central tracks down to the Case Main. That remained there during the early building days so that they could bring in that heavy limestone that they made all their buildings from. Eventually, that spur was removed. Eisenman also designed the Case Main, as well as a famous landmark in downtown Cleveland, the Arcade.
A national landmark.
A national landmark.
National Historic Landmark. Oh, it's a beautiful building.
Now, the next example I would cite is MICHELSON. MICHELSON, if you don't know who Michelson is, I'm told to take your degree back. Every case student has got to know the story of Albert Michelson. Now, he didn't spend a lot of time at Case, but he did his very important work at Case. Next was Armington, little known faculty member. He came from MIT, started or was the first instructor in mechanical engineering. And at the end of the first year or so, Staley called him in and said to him, if you're going to take this business seriously, you need some practical experience. So we're going to give you a leave of absence for 2 years to go develop some experience. Well, George Armington went off and formed a company called Euclid Crane and Hoist, which
Sure.
eventually became the Terex Corporation, a division of General Motors. He did not return to Case, but he did one thing very nice. He gave a gift of a chair. His sons gave a gift of a chair that I was privileged to hold for some 20 years, following Dan Wright as the first holder of the Armington chair. Finally, we get to Harry Reid. Harry Reid, I think, was a kinsman of John Stockwell. They both had an affinity for the basic math and basic sciences, where Stockwell might have approached his problems from an astronomical point of view. Harry Reid was much more down to earth. His first studies were in glaciology, which I believe started when he was a student in Europe. He did a postdoc in Europe. Here's a picture of Glacier Bay, one of the glaciers in Glacier Bay today. It is not the MUIR glacier, but it is very similar in construction, and it's a great picture to point out some important characteristics. This is the tidal glacier. That is to say, ice is calved from the ice face into a tidal pool and then floats out into the warmer water and melts. On the shores or moraines, you see a lot of debris, rock that was dropped there by the glacier as it retreated back. To walk on a glacier, you usually start by walking up the shore along the moraine and then up onto the surface. It is not a simple task, and if you have the opportunity to do it, I'd highly recommend it. The Glacier Bay suffered a major earthquake in 1896, and it was closed for decades, literally 2 to 3 decades. Tour ships were not allowed in there. Only experienced scientists were allowed in to do their work. This is when Harry made his switch from glaciology to seismology. He developed a theory called elastic rebound, and it was very important in analyzing the San Francisco earthquake. He's better known in the seismological world, and this is the Harry Reid gold medal for contributions to seismology. It's very interesting that Case used to give a Reid Prize. It was awarded to the outstanding undergraduate with the highest GPA at graduation. It was initiated by a gift from Harry long after he left Case. So he must have had some attraction or some affinity to Case. The other thing that was important about Case faculty is that they were encouraged to explore the unknown, to take that bold step into what we didn't know about, particularly if it added to the well-being of the residents of Cleveland. That was the demand of the Case family. Whatever they did, it had to contribute to the well-being of the citizens of Cleveland.
Noble goals. Okay, so they were encouraged to be explorer scientists, but come on, he could have gone up to Canada. He could have done Hudson Bay. Why Glacier Bay, Alaska? What sent him all the way up there?
Well, it's curious. National Geographic used to be a scientific publication, and at the time they had published an article by Professor Wright. Now that's not our Dan Wright from Case. This is a Frederick George Wright from Oberlin, who is both an ordained minister and a geologist. It's an interesting combination, but Professor Wright's specialty was a somewhat esoteric area topic. He wrote a lot on the relationship of man to nature, and he was writing on the relationship of the Ice Age to human actions, activities, and so forth. But he had published his findings from his trip to the MUIR Glacier from 1886, just a few years before. And the data didn't look right to Harry. Wright had claimed that he saw glaciers that were moving at the rate of 70 feet per day. And Harry Reid said that didn't quite make or didn't fit with his experience from glaciers in Europe. And so since he was trying to launch his career in glaciology, they planned an exhibition to Alaska. They picked Alaska for one reason: it was an easy trip. If you look at the United States at the time, on the left you see a map of the land grant railroads that were finished by 1890. I did have a picture in there that showed all the railroads, but it was so heavily cluttered up with these very small lines, railroad lines, that I decided to switch it for just the Transcontinental Railroad. The Northern Pacific Transcontinental Railroad had just been completed in the late 1880s, and so that was available to take their team from Cleveland to Tacoma.
Fascinating.
From there, sorry, Bob?
That must have been quite an enticement.
Well, it made an easy trip of it. I've tried to determine how much that trip would cost or what the price was in those days. And I've searched the internet looking for various data points. My guess is that it was somewhere between $35 and $50. Not a big deal, not a large amount of money by today's standards, but it must have been a fortune in those days. Secondly, they had the convenience of the Inside Passage. And here you see a modern map of the Inside Passage. They departed from Tacoma and made their way up to Glacier Bay. That's all within what's called Southeast Alaska.
Yeah.
If you make the trip, and this is where I'll put in a little bit of a commercial. If you make the trip, and I highly recommend it, be sure you not only see the Inside Passage, but you get up to Anchorage and Fairbanks. It is a totally different landscape there. They're both beautiful, but they're quite different. Finally, funding was an issue. Case was so tight with their money that they would loan him instrumentation, but they had no funds for his trip. And so it had to be a self-funded expedition. He borrowed some equipment from Case. Let me stop for a second. Money was so tight at Case that when they built the main building, they bought only machinery and drawing tables for students. They did not buy furniture for faculty. What they did was they encouraged people to bring their old kitchen sets in. And so Case, Maine, that burnt down in 1886, torched an awful lot of kitchen chairs and kitchen tables. So that wasn't the big loss. The big loss at that time was the building and their enthusiasm and pride.
Sure.
Now, I know that Reid accepted some funding from local residents. I know that McBride, Herbert McBride's father, contributed some because one of the railroad tickets was switched and it had to be returned to him so he could refund it for his money. But other than that, it was a very tight operation. They also borrowed equipment from the U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. So it was a shoestring operation.
All right, so he's got this big idea. He's got summer break to do it. Now he needed some people to go along with him. Who was his crew? Who was he able to rally to go on this journey?
It's a curious collection of Clevelanders, or people that lived in the Cleveland area. First was Henry Cushing. Henry was a son of actually a member of a prominent Cleveland family of physicians. He must have been the black sheep in the family because Henry went off to Cornell to study geology. He hadn't finished his Ph.D., but he had already taken a teaching job in Minnesota at a state teachers college when he was invited to join this expedition. Curiously enough, when he returned from the expedition, he immediately returned to Cornell, spent a year on a postdoc in Zurich, and ended up at Western Reserve at the invitation of Professor Morley, where Reid spent his career teaching geology and chemistry. Then there were two students from Case, Comfort Adams. Comfort Adams and there's Comfort Adams when he was a faculty member at Harvard University. He was a full professor of electrical engineering and served for some time as the Dean of Engineering at Harvard. His most advanced degree was a Bachelor of Science, which he received at Case.
So he was a student when he went on this trip?
He had just finished his degree, and the day before they departed on the train, he had graduated with his bachelor's degree. He had also been one of the student assistants for MICHELSON. And so he had one experience as a lab assistant for MICHELSON, and then took on this experience in traveling with Harry Reid.
Wow, what a school.
Curiously enough, he also went on to develop electric arc welding after World War I, when we needed to build the ships of war, and welding became an important aspect of it. Comfort Adams is credited with founding the American Welding Society. Second was John Franklin Morris. John Morris was a mechanical engineering student. He was actually the only enrolled student at the time of the expedition. He didn't get his bachelor's degree until 1891. He did, however, design the first mechanical engineering building, or that was his thesis that he presented and defended for his bachelor's degree. He held several positions around the Cleveland area, and his real success story was his son, John Jr., who formed the Morse Control Company in Cleveland. There are no photographs of John Morse. He had his own camera, so he became the second photographer on the tour. There are a couple of pictures where you can see his shadow in a picture that I've cropped, but there are no actual photographs of him. Or I was
It always happens. The person with the camera never gets in the photo.
That's right. Of course, that led to the creation of the delayed shutter, but that's another story for another time. Herbert McBride was a Yale student. He's the one at the head of the procession here.
This is in Alaska?
That's in Alaska. They're making a departure to explore the western regions of the MUIR Glacier. The second in line there, carrying the heavy backpack and walking with the ice hiking stick, that's a walking stick with a hatchet head on it. That's Comfort Adams. And last but not least in the lineup is Harry Reid with a blanket roll over his shoulder. You'll notice that Harry is wearing the uniform of the explorer, the campaign hat, the jodhpurs, the leather boots up to the knees. He always dressed the part. McBride when they returned, he went to work in the family business. Rudin McBride, which you may see signs downtown on the sides of some of the old warehouse buildings in the warehouse district. He became a member of the Case Corporation. Now, the Case Corporation at that time were wealthy industrialists from Cleveland. Herbert served on that board from 1902 to 1907 when he died unexpectedly of a heart attack. The executive committee of the Case Corporation board was considered to be the Board of Trustees, and that was made up of 7 members. Now, you have to realize that if you were a member of the corporation, the Case Corporation, if there was a cash call, that is to say, if the school was in need of cash, you had to dig into your pocket and put money in the pot. They did. Exton Case, nephew of Leonard, did not allow the year to close with a deficit balance. So that every year the budget had to be balanced. McBride also passed away unexpectedly at an early age in 1907. He died of a heart attack, and today we still celebrate his life with the McBride Lecture. Finally, there was Robert Caseman. You'll see him later in the picture of the cabin. His family was in the railroad business. They built railroads all over the United States. He passed away just a few years after they returned from Alaska. After a long illness, he spent some time in Colorado convalescing for a lung ailment. There are members of his family who believe that he damaged his lungs as part of this expedition. I can't comment on that, but needless to say, he was an important member of the team, and he seemed to find someone he knew almost every stop along the way. First and finally, I'd like to say all of these participants were educated as scientists and engineers. However, none of them, absolutely none of them, had experience as mountaineers or as experts in hiking glaciers. While some of them were outdoorsmen, some of them had their own equipment for outdoor elements. They did not have the kind of experience one would normally look for if you were putting a team together to go off to Alaska. So that left it to Harry Reid to teach them.
So they really were explorer scientists. That's amazing. No mountaineering experience. They're going to an uncharted frontier to do important science. So Tom, let's hear some highlights from this trip. What happens on a journey like this?
Well, as I said, they departed Cleveland by train on an auspicious day, Friday the 13th in June of 1880. They left by train. And Harry Reid's wife accompanied him. That was normal for her to travel when he traveled. But she also met a friend from Cincinnati who accompanied her on the rest of the journey and part of the journey back after Harry and his wife separated at Glacier Bay. They arrived in Tacoma on the 17th of June, just 4 days later. It was kind of an interesting trip. There was some anxiety along the way when the train had to go through Indian territory. But then they had to wait in Tacoma for almost a week while they waited for the next steamer to go by. So it was a period of layover, and they practiced with making measurements with their scientific instruments. They were measuring longitude and latitude, making sure the chronometers were wound good and tight, checking their magnetic instrumentation and so forth. They discovered that they had forgotten some of their equipment, and they sent word back to have it shipped. So Herbert McBride's father shipped that on on a later date. They arrived at Glacier Bay on the 1st of July. And an unbelievable thing happened. They were greeted on the shore by John MUIR. Totally spontaneous, totally unarranged. They had absolutely no idea that he was there. They had no contact with him before.
That was the John MUIR.
Pardon?
That was the John MUIR.
The John MUIR, yes, absolutely. The man who left his job in the sawmill in Juneau and started hiking glaciers and so forth, making the case for preserving the natural wonders of the Western world.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if he was aware of what had happened to the nature's wonders in the East, the damage that the public had done to some of the property, but John was very interested in preserving the Western nature wonders for future generations. Now it's curious, he had a companion there with him by the name of Henry Loomis. Henry was a very successful attorney from Seattle. I have a hunch that this is another way that expeditions were funded. After all, MUIR didn't have much money either, and I suspect that this expedition was funded by Henry Loomis so that he could spend a month accompanying John Muir on some of his treks to the hinterland. They were there to study the interglacial forests and the glacier itself. Now the picture on the right is a picture that was taken by John Morse, but it's the kind of thing that they were looking at, that John Muir and Henry Loomis were looking at when the day they arrived. That's a forest that it was left over when the glacier thawed, and so that forest was growing prior to the start of the last ice age. That is frozen wood that had been frozen for some 15,000 years. It's not petrified. In fact, samples were brought back and examined, and the wood for the most part was intact. There are very few bugs up in, that would attack frozen wood. And wow. So it was a very interesting study that was a spin-off from their scientific investigation.
And so they would be the first ones to have seen this in 15,000 years?
Well, except for the Indians, that
of course.
Indigenous people. But yeah, when John Muir went there in 1879, he was taken there by an Indian guide. There had been no white man in that area, and so very little was known of the area. Muir invited the Case team, the Reid's exploratory team, to join the encampment. They were at a location that it now is known as Muir Point, and I'm told there's a monument there that you can see. I'm going to stop for just a second, take a drink of water. So.
Oh, please do. I mean, that's amazing. So we all knew John Muir, the great naturalist, and to think he would be there at that time. And thankfully, he was glad to see them. And I'm sure they were glad to see him as well. Yep. So he invites them to join his camp on what today we know as MUIR Inlet. And yes. Was his hut and everything built at that time, or was it?
Oh my, no, no, not at all. Oh. And John, if you read John Muir's diary, he kind of mockingly commented that when the Case team unloaded their cargo, it was somewhere between 7 and 8 tons of equipment that they unloaded on Glacier Bay. Now, the picture on the left is taken from the eastern shore. That's what you would have seen looking out across the MUIR Inlet towards the ice front. That ice front, we'll talk about it later, and I'll give you some more facts about it. But the picture on the right is an interesting picture. That's the glacier as it ends, where it ends on shore. And you can gauge the size of that glacier by looking at the lower right-hand corner. There's an iceberg resting on the shore, and there's a little shadow in front of that iceberg. That's an adult male.
That's right.
Assuming he's somewhere of the order of 6 feet tall.
There's someone standing in front. Is there someone at the top of the iceberg as well? Is there 2 people there?
There may be. I'm not sure about that second one standing on top of that iceberg. Okay. It's quite possible. The tourists had free rein to walk wherever they wanted to.
Oh my!
They really were all over the place. In fact, the steamboat captain had built walkways to allow the people easy access to the face of the glacier, but that doesn't happen until much later. John Muir and Loomis stayed there for the summer. They interacted with the MUIR team. They went on excursions with them. They did some of the teaching. In fact, they even taught Harry Reid, I'm sure. They participated in extended discussions on the natures of that glacier and how it should be preserved. The students helped build MUIR Cabin, and they built most of its contents, which we'll see later on. And on 2 occasions, the Harry Reid's team rescued John Muir. John Muir was known for traveling light. Very often he would hike out onto the glacier carrying very little equipment and usually very little food. From time to time, they had to go out and rescue him. They'd find him sleeping under an ice shelf for protection and bring him back and help him return to normalcy. He would suffer snow blindness on more than one occasion. Bob, I think you have another question there. I'm not sure.
Well, so I'm wondering, what was Reid hoping to accomplish there? So he gets all the way there and he's got this several tons of equipment. They obviously were looking at some serious scientific exploration.
Well, again, you got to remember what the times were like. The United States had just purchased Alaska from Russia. In fact, they purchased Alaska in 1867. Seward's Folly was kept under military law until the 1880s, when President Arthur established the District of Alaska, very much like the District of Columbia, where our capital is. So they didn't have a civilian government there until 1884. So that was the beginning of settlement in Alaska, 1884. So it was frontier territory. The information was very sparse, very sparse. As far as maps go, fundamentally they were just coastal maps. Here's a picture of a map that I retrieved from U.S. Coast and Geodetic Survey. It's an 1889 version of that area, and it happens to be exactly the map that Harry Reid purchased on his way to Glacier Bay. He purchased a copy of this map in Juneau. So this is the information he had in his pocket when he arrived.
Okay.
On the eastern side of that map, you see the Lynn Canal. And those numbers are sounding depths. So it's primarily a navigation chart. On the left is the shoreline to the Pacific Ocean. And again, you see sounding depths and charted obstacles. Yeah. Inland, you see mountains that are located, but probably not very precisely. That map, or that insertion in the middle between the Lynn Canal and the Pacific shore is taken, it's an exact copy of the map that Professor Wright developed. Curious thing about it, it's misplaced. It's turned the wrong direction. It's drawn to magnetic north, but it's oriented in this map in polar north. So it's off by about 26 degrees. So that's the kind of information he had when he arrived.
Ah, he had a bad map, an inaccurate map.
He sure did.
Okay.
Sure did. Well, we have to remember that this area was not discovered until 1794 by Captain Vancouver. Vancouver described Glacier Bay as a 1,200 foot thick ice sheet, nothing else. There was another survey done in 1867 by a Russian captain, but I think he was taking inventory prior to the sale to the United States. And finally, while this land was well known to the Indians, John Muir was the first white man to venture into this area with the guide of an Indian. and taken to Glacier Bay in 1879. The first serious expedition occurred there in 1886 by Wright. He spent a month there. How much can you learn about a place in a month, particularly with the kind of weather that they have? We'll talk about that again in just a second. Harry Reid's exploration developed the first comprehensive data. They mapped the entire area. On the left, you see the full extent of the MUIR Glacier. That little inlet down in the bottom of the map on the left is shown in enlargement in the map on the right. It's the exact, I just photoshopped that out of there so that you can see some of the detail that Harry was able to produce. The full glacier is about 35 miles from northwest to southeast, and it's about 10 miles from northeast to southwest. And so the axis of the glacier, if you wish, lies along a line from northwest to southeast. They mapped that entire area over the summer. That's 800 square miles of water table that they collected information on. They also measured the magnetic field. They accurately determined the magnetic north. It had not been recorded previously. They had great difficulty in determining the longitude. Longitude's determined with the chronometer, measuring the time from England to the observatory in England to the location on the Earth. So Greenwich is the 0th latitude, and I'm sorry, longitude. They had a much easier time measuring latitude, which they carefully recorded. They cataloged the geology. That was primarily Cushing's job, and the vegetation also was the responsibility of Cushing. They recorded the meteorological data. There had been none prior to that. They had rainfall, temperatures, but it was only the 3 months that they spent there during the summer. In summary, the MUIR Glacier, let's see, I've told you about where it runs. Have I covered all my points? The ice front, let me talk about that ice front, and there it is. Go back to that ice front in the lower left is some 9,000 feet across. And it calves glaciers into the tidewater. The face of that ice front is some 200 feet high above the water line. And it's been, at that time, the ship's captain sounded the depth at 120 fathoms, which is about 720 feet. And so that's about 1,000 feet of ice from the bottom of the MUIR Inlet up to the very top surface of the glacier. They also did another very important thing that I think should be pointed out, and unknowingly made a contribution to the national parks movement, which turned out to be a very important contribution for John Muir. Scientific exploration had become part of the national attractions to nature. The American public were not only fascinated with comets and eclipses because they thought those were harbingers of the future. They were becoming much more interested in interacting with nature, but not to be entertained, but to be educated. They were much more interested in an intellectual pursuit. The Inside Passage became a very important corridor where they were introduced to it. The steamship lines traveled there with one steamship passing once per week. Again, I encourage you, if you're thinking of doing it, take that trip.
Oh,
fascinating trip.
I know we have alumni who have done it, and it just looks beautiful. I thought it was interesting on that poster when they say revisit the Ice Age, they mention Reid Glacier. So Obviously, early on, a glacier had already been named for him.
Well, there is a Reid Glacier, but Reid didn't name it for himself. That came a little later. But I do want to talk about some of the other named glaciers up there.
Okay.
Part of that national parks movement occurred the very first week that the CASE team was in camp there. They had stopped, set up their camp, and as I said, John MUIR kind of commented that they brought so much equipment. But the first week, the following week, when the steamship stopped, 280 passengers disembarked and milled around their campsite, inspecting the tents, inspecting their living conditions, some of them not even paying attention to the glacier. So that was a bit of a distraction. Captain Carroll of the steamship line was the real entrepreneur in this. He provided a weekly delivery service to Glacier Bay. He, I think maybe out of guilt, provided provisions for the Reid team. So this must have helped on their self-funded expedition when the steamship line provided them with fresh meat and produce. Another important thing is they committed to a fall pickup. Captain Carroll said he would be sure that there would be someone there to pick them up come fall.
Okay.
Finally, there are notes in Reid's diary and also in other sources that indicate that Captain Carroll delivered wood for a cabin. Now, I have a hunch that that was the captain's idea. If he could keep John MUIR reasonably close to the glacier over the period of the summer, then he would have more to sell to his passengers on his tour ship. The picture on the left has become an iconic picture for Glacier Bay and for the MUIR Glacier. You see most of the team that helped build that cabin. Notice how pristine that cabin is. It's got a shingled roof. All the seams are lapped with battens. There's a chimney that the students added. They tried at first to build that chimney by dry stacking glacial rock, but they found that it leaked too much and didn't have enough draw. And the first couple of fires that they had filled the cabin with smoke, only to force them into retreat, and they had to spend their time back in their tents. At the very top of the chimney, you'll see the one and only picture I have of Rob Caseman, or Bert Caseman. They did go back and mortar up some of the dry joints in the chimney. That cabin stood there for a number of years. Different people occupied it at different times. On the right, you see some of the furniture that the students made for them. There's a footstool with an oilskin cover on top. In the very bottom lower left, you see a crack in the wall. That was before they put the lap seams on, I hope. Either that or they missed it and it was leaky. Notice that the floor looks like it's a milled lumber, probably tongue and groove so that they didn't have floor drafts coming up from the cold earth below them. And leaning against the fireplace on the right-hand side is a buckskin gun case. Yes, they did carry weapons. Yes, they needed protection. And I'm sure you're going to ask me about that.
I am thinking, first of all, these guys had a busy summer. Not only were they mapping glaciers, they're building cabins. In some ways, it sounds like a class field trip, right? They took trains and steamships and followed a route that tourists were starting to go. It also had to have been dangerous as well. How dangerous was it?
Well,
and I want to remind our listeners, if anybody has a question, we're kind of running short on time here. So submit it now if you have a question to ask Dr. Kicher. But Tom, what kind of danger were they in?
Well, the train trip wasn't bad. They did stay together. That is, Edith and her girlfriend from Cincinnati that made the trip with her stayed with the Reid team to St. Paul. but then they decided to stay on the transcontinental road and not take the locals. The Reid team took local trains all the way, but when Edith's train passed some of the Indian outposts, there was some anxiety that the Indians were, they might be attacked by the Indians, but that never did happen, didn't come to anything. They, when they got to Tacoma, they had they were in fine shape. They boarded the ship. They started up the inside passage. There are two places along the inside passage that you should be ready for seasickness. At the Queen Charlotte's outlet and the Dixon entrance. These are areas where the Pacific Ocean is in direct communication with the shoreline. And so the swells that come across the Pacific Ocean, which is very deep, rise up onto the shore of the western slope of the Canadian shore and create a very rough sea in those two areas. If you can get by those two areas with not suffering any seasickness, then you've had a very comfortable trip. So there wasn't much hazard until they got to Glacier Bay. Certainly the glacier offered great hazard. Navigating the inlet waters was very difficult. Fighting off those glaciers, icebergs that frequently calved from the glacier was quite difficult. They had to learn to deal with not only the floating glaciers, but the prevailing winds. There were times when it would take them a half a day to cross from west to east and an hour and a half to cross from east to west. It was quite an experience. At one point, they boarded one of those icebergs and they climbed to the top. They used an anemometer to measure the barometric pressure so that they could measure the elevation. There was no real casualty there except for the barometer. They dropped it, ending the life of the barometer, but they were safe. Hiking on the glacier is the real hazard. There are some areas, first of all, that picture on the right that you're now looking at, that's the moraine up the eastern shore that they had to hike in order to go from the inlet to the top of the glacier. That's a pretty rough area to be hiking through, particularly in this climate or this area, because it's twilight most of the time and it's very difficult to see. The crevasses and pinnacles around the ice front were so hazardous they didn't dare go near them. And when they were in any danger, where they were any place close to what might have been danger, they were given instruction in how to use ropes, and they secured themselves to each other. So they were always well prepared for the trip. They did have, there is one other, I think I got another picture here. There it is. That's the one, that's the top of the glacier. Those seemingly innocent looking puddles that you see there may not be just a mere few inches deep. Some of those could be sinkholes. Now, a sinkhole develops in a glacier due to water currents swirling around the top and carrying the silt and the debris. It'll wear a hole down into the ice, and in the extreme will go all the way to the earth underneath. Casement dropped his ice axe in what he thought was a puddle, but it disappeared. It fell so far into the ice hole that they were unable to retrieve it. I guess it was a shock. They did have one.
Tom, we have a question here. So, yes. I mean, obviously they're measuring, they're surveying, and Professor Katie Wheaton asks, what is known about how they achieved their initial training in survey work?
Well, they all received surveying as an undergraduate course, no matter what field they were in. That was one of the fundamental courses. In fact, that's one of the reasons why I showed the map of the Case campus. That was a student project showing their ability to do surveying in University Circle. Now they had to take those talents to Glacier Bay.
So that worked. So what they learned at Case, they were able to apply in Alaska, and it worked.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. They,
All right.
Now they had two other hazards I want to quickly mention. One is that they did have an incident of misdirection. They got separated when they were walking across the glacier, and one team passed the other one not knowing that this was going on. So one team was hiking the wrong direction, and they were about to hike off into the far reaches of the glacier when they caught up with them and brought them back. Of course, there's always slippery footing, which leads to the possibility of falling and concussions and contusions. If that happens and you're thousands of miles from civilization, you better know your first aid. Finally, there was a need for protection from wildlife. The next picture shows Adams at the one campsite that they built primarily for relaxation. This was about 10 miles south of the glacier where vegetation had started to grow after the retreat of the glacier. You'll notice left of center, there's another gun case, and slung over that gun case, if you do a close-up, you'll see a gun belt with some fairly hefty rounds of ammunition. I'm told that those shells are 45-70s. That was the largest caliber rifle used in America at the time. It was a lever action weapon that would bring down an Alaskan brown bear with a single shot. So yes, they did have protection. But they also needed it on one occasion when they had to fire the cook. They had hired a man over at in the Lynn Canal, and he expected to have enough free time that he could do some prospecting in the Glacier Bay area. And then finally ended up in a fight with John MUIR. John MUIR outsmarted him by hiking out onto the glacier and getting the cook lost. So nothing ever came of it, but they did have their weapons in case they needed to resort to that sort of protection. And finally, there was a confrontation with one of the indigenous people. As part of their departure, the weather is a hazard. As part of their departure, they were forced to find their own way back to civilization. What I'm saying by that is that winter set in early. The tour boats suddenly stopped coming to Glacier Bay, but since the steamship company had promised them transportation out, they sent an Indian with a canoe. Well, there was a confrontation over what Harry Reid had to pay for the Indian services. And when Harry paid him what he thought the trip was worth, the Indian took the money and went back to his village, only to return in the afternoon wearing his best garb. He had on his US Navy captain's jacket. I don't know if he was trying to show that he could take that away from a Navy captain, or if he was trying to show that he was good at negotiating and horse trading. But there was an awful lot of bravado, and when the Indian threw the money down on the table, Harry Reid picked it up and put it in his pocket and said, "No more, that's it." So it was a lot of bravado, but nothing seemed to come from it.
Staff difficulties.
He did pay him for his services eventually, but certainly not to the satisfaction of the Indian.
All right, well, Tom, I'm afraid we're reaching the end of our time limit here. And I know you have more. I know that you have some people you want to thank. I want our viewers to know that this is your full report will be on our website at casealumni.org. You have a fascinating story in the Case alumnus, and I know you received a lot of help gathering this information.
Yes, I would like to thank, first of all, the Case Western Reserve University Archives. They were very, very helpful in providing a lot of information, as well as two other university archives operations. The University of Colorado at Boulder is a repository for the National Snow and Ice Data Center, and they also have an elaborate collection of Harry Reid's papers. and documents. And finally, the archivist at Johns Hopkins University provided us with a lot of information.
And I can tell you, I talked to some of these archivists, and they were all, many of them, surprised by what Tom was doing, what Tom was finding out. He was revealing stuff to them because, of course, we had Reid as a young man at Case, but he went on to become a great man at many other institutions.
Well, he did spend a short time at Case. I mean, he was there only until 1893 when he returned to his alma mater to assume a faculty position. But nevertheless, he made great contributions to setting the standards for the hiring of future faculty and the recruiting of students. I want to remind everyone that there used to be the Harry Reid Prize in Physics. It would certainly be nice if that were reinstituted. I think it would be very appropriate. And finally, I think it's very important for me, Bob, to give recognition to the Case Alumni Association for being so helpful in this, and you in particular. You have been very helpful in teaching me how to make this kind of a presentation to a class. Normally, I would give a lecture and not worry about whether or not my students were interested, but
no, they were interested.
You forced me to pay attention.
And great help from Lillian Messner as well. We want to thank Dr. Tom Kicher for sharing this with us, and we want to wish everyone a happy homecoming 2020. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Had a great time.